translating. And all right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started since we anyways started a little late. So my name is Daphna Tier. I'm based in Brooklyn, and I'm a member of the National Political Education Committee. I just want to thank you all for coming, and I want to start out the evening by thanking Michael from staff for all the hard work on this, and also to our translators, Heidi and Fern, who are working very hard on this, and as well to our volunteers for the evening, Danielle and Sanjeev and Maggie. And I wanted to just say thank you also to the groups that have organized this, which is the International Committee and the National Political Education Committee and the Ecosocialist Working Group. And then before we go any further, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge, you know, this is an Indigenous struggles panel. It's Indigenous Resistance in a World on Fire is the name of the event. And so I want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the stolen and unceded territories of the Lenni Lenape people. And I want to invite everyone to join me in acknowledging their communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. And I invite you to acknowledge the heritage of the land from which you join us today as well. If you even know the people's names and you want to drop that in the chat, that would be wonderful, with the understanding that this acknowledgement is really just a starting point for restorative justice towards Indigenous people. And I wanted to say, before I introduce our panelists, that both the International Committee and the National Political Education Committee are accepting applications. The next application for the International Committee is due by December 31st. Thank you so much to the people who are typing in the chat. I'm also dropping a link for the form in the chat right now, and we'll drop it again later in the evening for applying to the International Committee to do work like this, which is so important in building solidarity with other organizations. And then if you are interested in joining the National Political Education Committee, you can send your inquiries to the political education email address that I just dropped in the chat. And now, without further ado, I am going to introduce our panelists. One thing I just want to ask, last thing I will say is that, you know, as we're using the chat, we're just asking that people respect the chat, that people respect the speakers. And when you're typing in the chat, just think about what you might say if we were meeting in person, and type no more than you would if you were in an in-person meeting. With that said, so first, I just want to introduce our moderator for the evening, Nafis Hassan, who is a member of Boston DSA and the National Ecosocialist Working Group. He'll be moderating a conversation between Nick Estes of the Lower Bull Sioux Tribe, who is an assistant professor in the American Studies Department at the University of New Mexico, and he's the co-founder of the Red Nation. He's also the author of a book. Sorry, I want to get the whole name in because we are also wanted to feature this book, which is the Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Resistance. And that's been published by Verso Books. It's available to purchase online. Please, please get a copy of that to learn more about the history of Native American resistance in this country. The other US panelist that we have is Brian Parras, an Indigenous organizer who's based in Texas. He's a member of Sierra Club's Healthy Communities, and he's a proud member of the Progressive Workers Union and a co-founder and board member of Tejas, which is the Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services. And then joining us from Bolivia, we have Ruth Aripaz Kuki, and she's of the Ochupiamona Nation in Bolivia, and she is a co-founder of the Coordinadora General de la Coordinadora Nacional en Defensa de Territorios Indígenas Originarios, Campesinos y Áreas Protegidas de Bolivia. And I don't speak Spanish, so forgive me for butchering that. And finally, we're joined by Eloise Rocha of the Munduruku Nation, who's a leading member in the Brazilian Socialism and Liberty Party, PSOL, and a member of the Grupo Conciencia Indígena there as well. With that said, I'm gonna, without further ado, pass it along to Nafis and let the event begin. Oh, and sorry, I'm so sorry. Two more technical things to know. One is that if you are interested in translation, and I should have said this at the beginning, I apologize, you do need to click on the channel. It's sort of at the bottom right of your screen. It should appear, and you can choose Spanish or Portuguese. If you're speaking, if you want to hear the event in English, just stay where you are, and there will be closed captions during other languages. And Nafis, was there, so I just said there was going to be two things that I said, but I don't remember now.
No, I think that's it. Translation and closed captions.
Great. Okay, so take it away, Nafis.
Okay, thanks, Daphna. Welcome, comrades. I'm very excited for this conversation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be among these Indigenous organizers. So as we are speaking, as the panelists are talking, if questions come up to your mind, please post your questions to the using the Q&A option. So our first question is to Nick Estes. Nick, can you talk about the Indigenous struggle against environmental destruction by way of dams, pipelines, and resource extraction in the United States, and the relationship to Indigenous self-determination and nationhood, and why the state's reaction to this resistance has typically been so violent?
Thanks for the question, and I'll just start by way of introducing myself. Haumatakiapi nape chuzapi chante washte. It's just a traditional Lakota greeting with a good heart and a handshake to everyone who's listening. And thanks DSA National for inviting me as part of this talk. I think it's important to answer this question with what just was released in the news today, that Deb Holland, who is from the Laguna Pueblo and also a representative from New Mexico, where I'm calling from, is anticipated to be selected for the Secretary of the Department of Interior, which would make her the first Indigenous person, let alone the first Indigenous woman to be a cabinet pick, but also the head of the Department of Interior as well, or Secretary of Interior. So what this says, I think it's important because New Mexico is a battleground state for the oil and gas industry. New Mexico is the 5th largest producer of oil and gas. We're right next to Texas on the Permian Basin, but also New Mexico has the highest rates of murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls in the country. And that was a report that was issued by the Sovereign Bodies Institute. And these two issues are connected because where resource extractions, primarily fracking, is most intense is in the fractionated areas of the reservation, which tend to be the kind of borderlands areas where there's overlapping jurisdiction between state, tribal, and federal lands. And this is particularly important because in this moment in time, the indigenous movement is demanding, has kind of rallied under the banner of the phrase land back. That is, the return of indigenous land back to indigenous people. And part of that campaign is to go after public lands first and foremost. And I think there's a lot of anticipation around what Deb Haaland's selection for the Department of Interior might possibly mean as being somebody in charge, of public lands. And it's also important to remember that 40% of emissions from the United States actually come from public lands as well. And this has been the bludgeon for the Trump administration to actually open up areas for resource extraction, whether it's here in New Mexico through fracking on Bureau of Land Management lands, or whether it's in the Arctic, National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. The public lands have, historically been a category for, resource development and privatization, despite their kind of, whitewash history as being a kind of public good, right? So public lands, as we say here in the Southwest, are actually stolen lands. And this, raises a larger question about, somebody like Deb Haaland, who was at Standing Rock, who actually cooked for water protectors. So too did people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She herself was a water protector alongside somebody like Haaland. And so you can really see this kind of broader movement arising from specifically indigenous led resistance. I'm not trying to endorse Deb Haaland by any means, but just saying, like, tracing that history is important and putting her nomination into a historical context, because it might just get framed as some kind of, Biden pick or the benevolence of a Biden administration, when in fact, there is a very militant on the ground grassroots struggle that's being led by indigenous people, specifically in the climate justice movement. And with that has come, a rampant amount of state repression. And this comes in the form of, in places like the United States, a slurry of anti-protest bills. There is the American Legislative Exchange Council, which has passed state legislator bills specifically targeting or criminalizing the protesting of oil pipelines and oil infrastructure. And in a place like where I'm from, South Dakota, the state government is actually to the right of ALEC, and in fact has passed its own, what it calls, new generation protest laws, where it actually criminalizes potentially criminalizes the support of those pipelines and the support of those protests by outside or out of state interests. And that can mean like a church group sending money to, a pipeline protest in the Dakotas. But fortunately, because of grassroots mobilization, the most deleterious or detrimental effects of that particular law have been watered down. But nonetheless, there's a convergence with the COVID-19 pandemic, because in the United States, these right-wing or these right-wing governments, state governments, are denialists, and they operate in the realm of make-believe. And that goes both with COVID-19 and climate change. And so tribes have been embattled to protect their sovereignty, but also the health of their own citizens by setting up tribal checkpoints. Whereas the state has threatened to call in the National Guard to take those tribal checkpoints down because they interfere with interstate traffic, or so they say, or they interfere with traffic on highways. But what's been interesting about those particular battles and confrontations with the state, and mind you, these are in states like North Dakota and South Dakota, where 1 in 800 people
they were proud of their king or their god.
Where 1 in 800 people have actually died from COVID-19. So the rates of infection and the rates of death are incredibly high. And so in many ways, tribes are not only at the forefront of the climate struggle, but they were also at the forefront of combating COVID-19 and the spread of COVID-19. And this gets to the larger issue around indigenous self-determination, as well as indigenous nationhood, and where that plays into this particular.
Nick, sorry, could I just interrupt you for a minute?
Sure.
Our translators would appreciate it if you went a little slower. Thank you. Sorry.
And so in this particular moment, the struggle is about self-determination as well as indigenous nationhood. And at the center of this, is the question of indigenous sovereignty. And as we know, in the cases of both COVID-19 and climate change, when tribes are enacting their right to protect their homelands, they're doing it not just for the benefit, of their citizens or their membership, but they're protecting land, water, for the benefit of everyone. And in the case of COVID-19, they're protecting people's public health, right? And so this is a larger metaphor for, I would say, the broader struggle in relation to social movements throughout the world, and thinking about what role do indigenous people play. And I just want to conclude with thinking about indigenous caretaking, that is caretaking land, water, hence the labels land defender or water protector. Thinking about that in terms of indigenous stewardship, because currently indigenous people, and this includes places, this is the United States as well, protect 80% of the world's biodiversity, and currently caretake about 1/4 of the world's landmass. And in areas under indigenous stewardship, environmental degradation is less severe. And I would say that when we think about things like water protector and land defense, we should also think about it in terms of work. And so when there are proposals for energy transitions or transition away from not only capitalism, but the fossil fuel economy, which undergirds the current capitalist system, there's a fear that people are going to, quote unquote, lose their jobs, or that we have to create jobs. And I would say that indigenous people, indigenous land defenders, whether they're protecting land or water that we all need, the air we breathe, they are providing a public good for the rest of the planet. And increasingly, as we all know, indigenous land defenders are being assassinated, criminalized, and imprisoned. And so therefore, by default, we are the tip of the spear when it comes to climate justice and climate change.
Thank you, Nick. That was a very sweeping answer to so many of the issues that we actually wanted to hear from you about. Our next, so sort of moving on to the bringing the issue of indigenous self-determination to a global scale, I would like to ask Ruth this question. Can you talk about the struggle against dam building in Bolivia and indigenous self-determination within a state that is led by indigenous people? What role has your organization played in such resistance? And also, how can socialists in the United States better understand the different perspectives within indigenous society in Bolivia? Ruth? Ruth, you're on mute. You have to unmute.
Sorry.
No worries.
Thank you. Thank you, Nafis. And thank you so much to the DSA for inviting me to attend to this dialogue. And I'm going to give you a little bit of the context in Bolivia, at least for the last 14 years, and to understand a little bit maybe about the situation of indigenous peoples in Bolivia. First, I want to say that probably I'm going to disappoint some of people, but in Bolivia, there was no a government led by indigenous peoples, and certainly not in the present. What we had and have instead are groups with indigenous titles that we were used by a president with a visible indigenous background during 14 years under the pretense of socialist government. Second, very important to make clear that in Bolivia, Evo Morales' mass party used the socialism only as a speech and public image, and for their own interest to keep themselves in power. So in Bolivia, particularly for the indigenous peoples that are defending our territories, this socialism is something related to the violation of our rights. For us, there is no difference between the right, the left, socialists, and doesn't matter who is in the government, they will use the government to convert the capitalist interests into national policies. And these policies are in favor of oil exploration, concentration of land in small groups for the agribusiness, for GMOs, deforestation, cattle ranching, gold mining, construction of mega dams for hydroelectrics, waterways that only benefit the capitalism. In Bolivia, despite having a constitution that includes specific articles to protect the indigenous people's rights to exist freely, for example, to live in our territory with autonomy and self-determination, according to our own social, economic, cultural, spiritual, and democratic systems, we are very far away from consolidating it. This because all the resources are in our territories and are very coveted by extractivists. And we are considered a minority and an obstacle for development in our ancestral land. In our case, in the Bolivian Amazon region, since 2016, we struggle with and face the forces and power of the government. When our 17 communities organized in our mancomunidad de comunidades indígenas of the Rio Beni, Tuichi, and Quiquibay rivers, we stopped the studies for the Chepete and El Bala mega dams that would flood 6 indigenous nation territories and will forcibly displace indigenous peoples like the Moseten, Chimane, Eseja, Leco, Tacana, and Uchupiamona, beside affecting the 2 protected areas as the mega diverse Madiri and the reserve of the biosphere Pilon Lajas. And 5 rivers will disappear forever. That's the kind of project that this so-called socialist government is imposing in our indigenous territories in Bolivia. And our organization, Mancomunidad de Comunidades, was created in 2001 to defend our territories from a consortium that was invading our territories. And almost 20 years later, we continue defending it from the government that has the plan to convert Bolivia into the fuel herd of South America for the big companies. In this context, if our organization would not exist, it is certain that we will not have our territories at this point. That's the role that our organization has, but we are under a constant threat to disappear as indigenous peoples. Because we have the right to a free and pure consultation for our consent, and that's not been, and we are part of a lot of treaties or, declaration that Bolivia signed, but they are not respecting that. So right now with the pandemic situation that they need to, I don't know, they need to improve the economy, but they are watching our territories as the only place that where they are going to extract more resources to sell. So that's obviously, but in a pandemic situation, that extractivism, it was worse during the pandemic. So right now we just have a new government of the mass, and I don't know if maybe you heard about the Timnis, and the Timnis right now it is very threatened to disappear, and all the 64 indigenous communities that live in this territory. So that's the same situation in all Bolivia. In Bolivia, we have 4 macro regions: the highlands, the Chaco, the Amazonia, and the valleys. So all the indigenous peoples are in the same situation. So that's that's the situation in Bolivia right now, and that we are living.
Thank you, Ruth, for that very illuminating comments. This is a very interesting discussion that we hope to come back to, but I want to go to Brian to speak a little bit about what Ruth mentioned about this destruction of nature for extraction, what is sometimes known as environmental sacrifice zones. Brian, could you speak a little bit about how these sacrifice zones are created under capitalism, how they affect communities, and how indigenous communities are organizing against them? And the other question is, can these zones, sacrifice zones, really be separated, or do they leak into beyond their borders and affect all of us?
Well, I think you know the answer to the second one, but welcome everyone. Thank you for allowing me to be here, and I'm honored to be on the panel with all of the other guests. I live in Houston, Texas, and I am in one of the cities that has ended up becoming, epicenter, one of the main epicenters of oil and gas industry. And, the city actually came about because of what remains to this day, the worst environmental disaster in terms of death still. And that was the Great Storm 1900 that hit Galveston Island and killed over 8,000 people. Don't know the exact numbers, but that led to the creation of this, inland port, and many things converged at the same time. The discovery of oil, creation of the combustible engine, and 2 world wars. But my family, actually, both my parents come from West Texas, closer to where Nick is in New Mexico. And they grew up in a part of the state that is now, still one of the largest producers of oil and gas. That's in the Permian Basin. And they were raised in and around Big Spring, Texas. And both of these places, have carried a lot of weight in how I understand the work that I do, and how I try to relate to the work that I do, because they're significant places. And West Texas and Big Spring in particular was named after these natural springs that are in a very arid place, and had been used for thousands of years, for drinking water, for migration routes. And, it is now a city that has to recycle its own wastewater to provide even, drinking water, to have water for flushing your toilets and bathing in. And some may consider that like a miraculous feat of engineering, and it certainly is, I think a beautiful thing to be able to clean water. But I think what resonates with me most is how it got to that point and why it got to that point. So I grew up in East Houston, specifically, and about 4 miles from the beginning of the Houston Ship Channel. And I'm in the home that I grew up in right now. I moved back in with my mother right as the pandemic was really presenting itself to the world back in March, and it's been a real interesting time for me because I've been to places that folks would call sacrifice zones. And that word is an interesting word because, it's been used to denigrate, my ancestors and my people for sacrificing, engaging in sacrifice. And I don't necessarily agree or know that the way it's been described to me is how it took place. But certainly, the idea of a sacrifice zone is for the benefit of the greater good, right? For everyone. But who chooses, right? Who is sacrificed? And what does it mean to be sacrificed? Well, for me, living in Houston and understanding the place that even my parents came from, it means, complete destruction of the land, and a separation of the self from the land, and a violent sort of relationship with the air, the water, the soil, all those things, so that you get to a point where the outside world is not a safe place. It's not a place that brings you joy. It actually causes harm. And so when I hear the stories of, and when I meet with folks in other places, that's really what gives me the most understanding and pain, to know that folks have not chosen that situation, right? And they certainly don't benefit even from, the greater good that is supposedly, to the benefit of us all. So those things are, much deeper. And I'll share in the chat a link to a toxic tour I did with Amy Goodman after Hurricane Harvey, because I know my time is up. And you can check that out later. Don't click on it yet.
Thanks, Brian. I really wish we could give every panelist like the amount of time they deserve to unpack these beautiful things you all are saying. But unfortunately, here we are. But thank you. And I really want to pick up on that thread of what you said about sacrifice versus if they had the choice and for the greater good, because at times what is presented as sacrifice is actually, it's also dependent or divided along racial and ethnic categories. And this is where I would like to pose a question to Eloise. Eloise, if you could tell us a little bit about the struggles of Brazilian indigenous communities against deforestation, illegal mining, the soy plantations and cattle grazing, and now the pandemic, and how have these changed over time in the different conditions, such as under the dictatorship, the neoliberal policies of the center-left Lula government, and even the right-wing fanaticism under Bolsonaro. Eloise?
Sim, bom. Já? Posso falar? Pode, por favor. Pode repetir mais uma vez. Não entendi um pouco.
Yes, of course. Sorry about that. So the question is, can you describe a little bit about the struggle of Brazilian indigenous communities against deforestation, illegal mining, the soy plantations and cattle grazing, and now the pandemic? And how have these changed over time in the different conditions, such as the dictatorship, the neoliberal policies of the center-left Lula government, and the right-wing fanaticism under Bolsonaro?
Sim. Boa noite. Me chamo Heloíse Rocha. Sou indígena, aqui do Baixo Tapajós. Só uma correção, não sou descendente do povo Munduruku, sim do povo Tapajó. Sou e estou presidenta do PSOL aqui em Santarém. Faço parte também do grupo Consciência Indígena aqui na minha cidade. De fato, né, nesses anos que a gente vive o governo Bolsonaro, né, foi um momento, né, 2 anos de gigantescos retrocessos para os povos indígenas, onde, de fato, o Bolsonaro não fez nada do que ele não falou na campanha eleitoral. Ele anunciou que não teria 1 metro de terra demarcada para os povos indígenas e, infelizmente, foi isso que aconteceu. Então, a gente vive um período de abandono, de tentativa de extermínio mais uma vez, né? Nós, povos indígenas, resistimos há 520 anos, mas desde da invasão do Brasil, acredito que passamos, né, por um momento muito crítico depois do processo de democratização, né, de redemocratização do Brasil. O governo Bolsonaro ele é um dos que mais ataca, né, um dos que mais discrimina e não reconhece as populações indígenas do Brasil. Acho que hoje a principal pauta dos povos indígenas é a demarcação de terra, né? A demarcação de terra, respeito ao modo de vida, saúde e educação. Hoje, nós podemos dividir a luta, né, dos povos indígenas nesses três eixos, mas a demarcação de terra ela é a principal, porque junto com ela, né, junto com o reconhecimento da terra, junto com o espaço, o local destinado aos indígenas, a gente traz todas essas outras políticas, que é o respeito ao modo de vida, saúde, educação e outras políticas públicas que são importantes. Né? De fato, desde a ditadura militar, a gente não passa por um processo de genocídio tão grande, né? E de abandono e principalmente de negação de direitos. Né? Hoje, o que a gente vive no Brasil é uma negação de direitos, uma negação do ser, né, de ser indígena. Então, e a gente compreende isso como um projeto. É um projeto do capitalismo, é um projeto para exterminar os povos indígenas. Afinal, nós somos os guardiões, né, da terra, nós somos os guardiões da floresta. E hoje, né, no Brasil, assim como em vários locais pelo mundo, mas no Brasil especificamente, o que o capitalismo quer é se apropriar da terra, das florestas, dos rios, né, extrair, né, o máximo, né, das riquezas da Mãe Terra, e ele encontra no seu caminho os povos indígenas, né, mas para que a gente seja barrado, para que a gente seja impedido de fazer isso, vem o projeto aí do Bolsonaro, né, financiado, claro, né, pelo grande capital, para tentar nos limitar ao máximo. Então, é tudo, né, na região que eu vivo, que é a região do Pará, na Amazônia, em Santarém, no Baixo Tapajós. Hoje, as principais ameaças que nós temos aqui é a questão da soja, a invasão da soja, né? A mineração ilegal, né? O garimpo ilegal, né? E as hidrelétricas, né? Nós temos foi um grande elefante branco, e aí já é uma outra discussão, também seguindo dessa, porque foi uma hidrelétrica construída num período de um governo dito progressista, que foi o governo do PT, atrás disso tudo. Então, foi um projeto que foi construído nesse período, num período teoricamente democrático, teoricamente progressista no Brasil, mas que para os povos indígenas foi extremamente cruel também, né? Porque nós não fomos respeitados quando nós dissemos que não queríamos hidrelétricas nos rios, né? Não queríamos barragens, por entender que o rio, né, ele não é posse, não é nossa posse, ele é extensão nossa, né? Sem ele, sem o rio, sem as florestas, a gente não consegue sobreviver. Isso não é algo de forma, como eu posso dizer, hoje a gente vê que isso não é algo só mitológico, né? Mas é algo real. A gente está vendo a crise climática que a gente vive no mundo, né? E a gente sabe que sem floresta em pé, sem os rios sem ser barrados, a gente não tem condições de nos manter, né, nessa terra. Está em um processo muito, muito grave, né, que é o processo de degradação ambiental, que a gente está indo para um abismo que pode ser que a gente não consiga voltar. Então, hoje em dia, os povos indígenas do Brasil e do mundo, eles são os grandes guardiões da Mãe Terra, né? Os grandes escudos que estão tentando frear toda essa, mas é globalizado, a gente tem que compreender isso, assim como o agronegócio tenta exterminar, né? Tenta extrair ao máximo as riquezas na Bolívia, ele faz a mesma coisa no Brasil. Oi? Tá, tudo bem, desculpa. Comecei a falar um pouco rápido, tá? Vamos devagar, vamos falar rápido. Então, é isso, né? O ataque do capitalismo, né, desse sistema nefasto, predatório, ele é um projeto mundial, né? Ele não vai cessar até extrair a última riqueza, né, da nossa Mãe Terra. E a nossa tarefa principal, né, não só das populações indígenas, é muito importante esse espaço aqui, né? A gente hoje está na linha de frente, mas a gente precisa de uma retaguarda. A gente precisa de pessoas ao nosso lado. E é necessário, com esses espaços aqui a nível, né, a nível internacional, que a gente consiga parcerias, que a gente consiga ecoar esse espaço, que ele não fique só aqui, né? Essa voz dos povos indígenas, que ele não fique só aqui, que ele seja ecoado, né? E que a gente consiga, de fato, né, organizar, né, um grande escudo de proteção à Mãe Terra, contra o capitalismo e também que a gente consiga fazer, de fato, né, eu acho que trazer também para a gente aqui de como o modo de vida dos povos indígenas é próximo ao que a gente pensa teoricamente sobre o socialismo, né? É muito próximo, só que a gente sempre fala que o socialismo, né, dos povos indígenas ele é praticado na teoria, na prática, ele é feito na prática sem a teoria, sem as teorias marxistas, sem os grandes teóricos socialistas. Então, é muito importante que a gente faça essa conexão, né, entre as teorias, entre a prática também do que a gente vive, para que a gente consiga, de fato, né, barrar aí os grandes malefícios do capitalismo. Já, né? Foi?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eloise, for those comments. And just to build off on your last comment about the need for Marxist theory and socialism to fight against capitalism, I actually want to ask a very similar question to our panelists, starting with Ruth. That's something our audience also would like to know. Because there are indigenous struggles and indigenous concepts of socialism that existed before Marxism, what can socialists learn from current indigenous struggles and vice versa? And how do we build international solidarity among all of these different struggles? So we'll start with Ruth.
Thank you, Nafis. Well, I think it has, something I would like to say is that I think it has to do with our comprehension on ourselves as human species and how the indigenous peoples live in our territories. And I think as human, we haven't realized yet that we are just one of the million and millions of the other different species that inhabit this land, where all the other species don't destroy the place where they live, they take care of it.
Ruth, are you still there?
I think we are in the same channel with okay. I was saying, and yeah, no, we need to understand how the other species take care of their home. They understand they need the fundamental resources to live, as the air, the water, the land. If they won't have all that, they will die. So they really understand the true value of the resources that they need to live, and they use the resources to live. And none of the other species are destroying the world to accumulate material possessions or money. But the human species doing completely the opposite. Humans don't care about poisoning the air, the land, the water, the food, what the future generations will breathe, drink, and eat. What other species on earth does that? The water comes from as a gift from the land, from the forest. and their limited resources. But the companies are appropriated to sell to us, as well as destroy with mining, with oil exploration, with deforestation, and now they want to make more money by water Stockholm and Wall Street. That is insane. For us, it's just how you can do that. And so the difference between the indigenous on how we live, capitalists or socialists are on how each one wants to use the nature. We, the indigenous peoples, know that the resources are used to live, to reproduce the life. And that comprehension makes us respect nature and be grateful. And I would like also say that the indigenous peoples, we are not fighting just for our survival. We are fighting for all the species survival. So it is a bit bigger than just only an environmental defense. We defend the life of the planet. And that means the life is of all the species, including my children, your children, who have the right to exist as species as long as they can on this planet. But living, learning, watching how nature works and enjoying what nature has to offer us, and not being, I don't know, being slaves or on our own greed or material positions. I think that's a kind of illness and that's are destroying the life, not just to indigenous peoples, but to all of us. And in Bolivia, in the last 14 years, we, the women, are defending the water, the land, our territories, the protected areas. And but it is a kind of, we are in the desert, yelling in the desert, and nobody is listening to us. And countries like Bolivia, it seems that is not important, but we have a part of Amazonian here, and that's being destroyed. The last year, it was burned around 6 million hectares of the Chiquitania forest. And this year, we burned 4 million hectares to introduce eucalyptus, transgenic eucalyptus, and to expand the agriculture. So it is the indigenous people, but all the human and all the people around the world are threatened by this politics that maybe a small country is affecting here, their life. So I think that's something that should alert us on what is happening, and how us as indigenous people, we practice the socialist taking care of all our community members on if you have enough food, if you are healthy, if you have sufficient resources like water, or if you are, I think that's socialism, right? And to be worried or take care about others in our community. But the people who calls the leaders of the world, they are not thinking like that. They are just thinking on how they can make favors to the capitalists. I think that's something that we really, really need to think across the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. Brian, could you tell us a little bit about how you can see us building this solidarity both with nature and across the world that Ruth mentioned a little bit about?
Yeah, and I thank you again. Um, to finish off my thought from the first question too, I just wanted to say that indigenous people practice sacrifice every day, right? And I think, the words that we just heard from Ruth and things that Nick mentioned, right? Putting your body on the line, on the front line, that's sacrifice. And so there's a difference, again, between willful sacrifice and forced sacrifice. But to answer your question right now, I think of the young indigenous Chicana activists from Arizona who introduced an idea to me that comes from the Maya, and that's in Lakesh, you are my other me. If I do harm to you, I do harm to me. If I love and respect you, I love and respect myself. And I think that's, a very common practice in many indigenous cultures across the globe, right? This isn't something that necessarily is unique to people on Turtle Island, but certainly it is something more familiar and more present in how we live and how we practice and how we understand our responsibility to each other. So I think that is what carries solidarity the farthest, and it takes work. It takes real work on the part of the individual to understand their privilege, to understand how their choices impact others, and it speaks to the way Nick started this conversation with recognizing people like Miss Halland and Miss Cortez, going to Standing Rock. And I know that Cortez herself has said that was a pivotal moment in her sort of development and consciousness, right? It's like becoming radicalized. Really, it's just becoming human, becoming conscious, and understanding, and feeling the weight of that responsibility. And to move that into action, you have to have empathy. You have to be a compassionate person, and you have to respect life. So those are the things that I think are important. And for me, the way I have tried to develop that in myself is to know, where I live. I'm in Houston, again, the epicenter of, sort of the brain trust of the fossil fuel industry, and it has tentacles across the globe, right? It's like there's never a place I've been to that has extractive industries that doesn't have some Texan's fingerprints on it, whether in Canada or in South America, Central America, and so many places even beyond this continent. So I've tried to make that a big part of how I think about my work and how I do my work here, by recognizing that, acknowledging that, and not just fighting for clean air right here in Houston, but understanding that those same companies have facilities in other places, right? And building relationships with those communities who are fighting the same company, and learning from them on things that have already been lost to me, that have been taken from me, my indigenous language, my songs, my ceremonies. Those things then become ways that I am also presented and gifted with even more enjoyment and ways of appreciating, being here. So I don't know what that looks like for each person, but that's, what I would offer as a guide, to start with where you are, and understand who your people are, and what your responsibilities, are. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. The quote you shared from your comrade is so beautiful. That was pretty amazing. So to Eloise, the question about solidarity, I would also want to add a question we got from the audience, is that what suggestions would you have for understanding the situations for Indigenous peoples outside the United States, considering that American media and NGOs have only served the interest of American business and empire abroad?
Certo. Então, eu acho que a gente, às vezes, a gente se perde ou se prende, na verdade, né, muito à teoria socialista, mas, às vezes, pouco reconhece ela ou pouco tenta implementar ela na prática, né, na prática que eu digo é na vida cotidiana, né, e os povos indígenas, eles têm, né, práticas socialistas de viver em comunidade, de se organizar de forma... eles têm essas práticas de organização, de luta, de convivência, né, na luta pelo bem viver, que a luta pelo bem viver nada mais é do que a luta, do que a vida em harmonia, né, a viver em harmonia com a Mãe Terra, é conseguir extrair somente da Mãe Terra o que é necessário para que a gente viva, né, de uma forma confortável, de uma forma bem, né? E a gente, muitas vezes, eu acho que o que nos falta enquanto socialistas teóricos, né, que leem vários teóricos socialistas, é a gente conseguir praticar, ou então observar na prática de como é que, de fato, a gente poderia ou pode, né, viver o socialismo, né, que às vezes a gente vive na teoria, mas não consegue viver ele na prática. Os povos indígenas, eles vivem, né, o socialismo sem a teoria, e vivem ele na prática, né, como se organizam nas aldeias, como se organizam nos seus locais de vivência, as suas lutas, na verdade, as lutas pela demarcação de terra, que não é uma terra para uma família indígena, para uma pessoa, para ser denominada, mas é a luta pela terra para aquela etnia, para aquele povo, para aquela comunidade. Então, acho que a luta pela demarcação de terras, ela é algo que ela é muito, como posso dizer, é um exemplo muito emblemático do como viver, de fato, o socialismo, né? Porque a luta pela demarcação de terra, ela vai passar por isso. A terra que vai ser demarcada, ela é da comunidade, né? Onde não tem dono, onde tem zeladores, né? Que no caso são os povos indígenas, né? O respeito ao modo de vida, como se vive de forma não hierárquica, de forma comum, né? Hoje não mais tanto por conta do desmatamento, né? Mas antigamente é viver da caça, da pesca, né? Fazer seus artesanatos e ali tentar viver num sistema de trocas. Claro que a gente não está falando para a gente, como posso dizer, andar para trás, retroceder, mas e sim como é que a gente pode, a partir do que os povos viviam e vivem ainda uma parte aqui no Brasil, como é que a gente pode colocar de fato esse nosso socialismo teórico, né, na prática do que já se vive, né, de forma normal. Acho que já pode, acho que era isso. Deu 1 minuto já. Pediram para falar, tinha acabado o tempo. Então já foi que eu já perdi ali.
I'm sorry that you didn't have. Thank you. Because I actually want to say exactly somebody put in the chat that because I actually want to say exactly somebody put in the chat that I from indigenous struggles, where do they connect, and where are they potentially at odds, and also why should socialists support the indigenous struggle beyond the moral imperative of social determination. And lastly, how do we create such conditions for solidarity?
I think my perspective is I'm not so much interested in socialists learning from our movements. I am a socialist. We are socialists. I'm part of an indigenous socialist organization. But that doesn't mean that all indigenous people are socialists either. There are indigenous people who engage in capitalist development. There are those who are anti-socialist or anti-communist. There are those who align with the United States in imperialist wars, and so it's indigenous is a category that's very diverse and contentious, and it doesn't mean just one thing. And they're also very, as you can see, there's very different views on what that means in different places. But I would say that we don't really our perspective collectively as an organization is we don't really want allies that take our knowledge for their movements, but we do want comrades, right? And that's a very distinct political alliance. We have terms of relationship and relationality within indigenous society, whether it's with humans or non-humans. But unless we're using that knowledge to become, to create good relations among humans, first and foremost, how can we create good relations with the natural world? And, to kind of further push that point, I would say that Marx himself, didn't invent socialism, but he himself also learned from socialist movement or from indigenous movements to create and to theorize actually existing socialism. I think Heloise pointed this out very clearly. And I would say that the human species as a whole is not against nature or is not automatically, an environmental concern. Systems are, right? And you can't just step outside of history and say that all a universal human trait is to pollute the environment or to damage the environment. That system that does that commodifies and exploits nature is called capitalism, right? And I would say that our current mode of production, even as indigenous people, all of our modes of production, we can't step outside of that capitalist system because capitalism is a world system. And so our mode of production, whether we like it or not, is capitalist in this moment in time. However, as indigenous people, we have lived without capitalism or non-capitalist societies for such a long time that our cultures, our worldview has evolved in ways that are non-capitalist, right? And they've survived that initial genocide and invasion system, and they're still surviving that. And they provide those remnants of living in a non-capitalist way, culturally and socially, whether it's with indigenous or humans or non-humans, can provide a model or the roots for a non-capitalist or socialist system, right? And there's much more to say about that, but I don't want to be too theoretical in my perspectives. But I will say that again, there's a reason why Indigenous people, as each presenter has pointed out, are at the forefront of not only the environmental movement, but I would say of the class struggle as well. And we as Indigenous people, we are not primitive people. We do believe in development. I want my grandparents, I want my aunts and my uncles to have clean drinking water. Some of them don't even have running water in their homes. Some of them don't have electricity. Some of them don't have access to, adequate education or healthcare. And the simple fact of the matter is you can't eat ideology. We can explain that, the perfect relationship is living in harmony with nature, but what do you do about people who are hungry, who need homes, who are in need of those very basic material things? It doesn't say you have to have one without the other. You can have both. It's just, it requires a revolution of values in defining social development in terms of people's needs, basic human needs, and the rights of nature. They don't come into conflict. As Eloise said before, we do take from nature, but not in a way, without also giving back. And I think there are movements that we can point to, whether they're in the South or the North, that have experimented bravely and have been attacked, whether it was through CIA-backed coups or US-backed coups, or through the criminalization of Indigenous water protectors and land defenders. But nonetheless, this has to be a heroic creation. It can't just be a model that comes from Europe. And I think in that sense, Indigenous people are not in the past, so to speak, but we are the future of that working class struggle.
Thank you so much, Nick. That's a really great way to unfortunately in this panel, since we're almost close to finishing time, so I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Nick, Ruth, Brian, Eloise, for all your valuable insights and sharing with us your experiences in the struggle. And thank you all for attending. Thank you to our translators and the caption writers, Fern, Jackie, Heidi, and all the organizers, Daphna, Sanjeev, Danielle, Maggie, and Michael from the DSA staff. And thank you for attending. And may we all be comrades. Solidarity.
Mateo.